This is Leadership Beyond, your community of conversation.
But this is the first time in my professional career that everybody, 100% of us, are consciously aware we are engaged in the change initiative.
Yeah, everything. I mean, COVID caused us all to go through change, right? At the same time, but our experiences were so different.
Facing these unprecedented times in isolation is pure insanity. We are so fortunate to have Brian Ahearn joining us today. Brian is an author. He recently published the book, The Influencer, The Secret to Success and Happiness. And Brian is going to run us through some of the core principles of influence and how to use them ethically to impact other people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
One of the things that I got out of this interview was so closely tied to the change management work that I'm doing right now with a client is being able to take these principles of influence and relate them to the different audiences that we are addressing, from executive leaders down to store associates. So it really spreads the gamut of breadth to be able to apply in so many different situations. So I think you'll really look forward to it.
And I'd like to comment on a little touch Brian has. And to me, it demonstrates that he practices what he teaches. And when I talked to Brian before the interview, he had my name and a little hello in the background, meaning this is my time. It's not really about him, although he's sharing his expertise and he loves to teach and help others to get good results. He had, and you'll notice early on, and we didn't work it into the conversation because we ran out of time, but he had a Leadership Beyond on his board and he said hello to Adrian and I. So he practices what he teaches. He's clearly believes that the ethical considerations are first, not manipulation. And in this recording, you'll hear what the difference is and how you can apply these principles to get better results and better relationships.
We hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Brian.
I'm excited to be here, and it's nice to meet you, Adrian, and great to see you again, Tom.
Good to see you, Brian. Thanks.
Yeah. You know, I'm so interested to hear your insights on the power of influence and persuasion, but in not a crummy salesperson-y kind of way, right? So, but before we jump in, would you just share a little bit about your background?
Sure. I spent the entirety of my career in the insurance industry, started right out of college, found that it was a great industry to be in. I really knew nothing about it when I stepped into it. And about 20 years ago, when I was involved with sales training, I came across the work of Dr. Robert Cialdini. I was fascinated by it because his approach to influence was all about ethical influence. Everything he talked about was research-based, and it applied to what I was doing in the sales training. The light bulb came on. I was like, holy cow, what he's talking about. This explains all the sales approaches we use, why they work or why they don't. And so I started utilizing his material, and then through a series of events, ended up coming in contact with him and have been one of his certified trainers now for more than a dozen years.
Well, I would key in on something, and from Adrian's introduction, it's unfortunate that salespeople get the reputation, and also unfortunate that it's often well used, but some of those manipulative techniques no longer work and they turn people off. And unfortunately, they think of it as sales, and sales is really a form of service. And I know your background has a lot of sales in it. So build a little bit more on ethical versus unethical use of principles before we dive into the principles themselves.
Okay. Well, let me say this to start, that if it were not for the contrast between ethical influence and manipulation, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. It was after coming in contact with Cialdini's material It was a presentation he had done at Stanford, and it was awesome. And so I signed up for Stanford's marketing, and they had all kinds of great resources. But one day, one of their marketing flyers came across my desk at work, and in bold letters, it said bestseller, and it had Cialdini's picture. And right underneath it in bold letters, call it influence, persuasion, or even manipulation. And I was like, oh, I cannot believe they actually use the word manipulation, because he's so clear about non-manipulative ways to influence people. Doing this the right way, it's paramount to me. And when I talk to people about influencing others, I want them to know that it's non-negotiable, that we have to do it the right way, because it will only harm the other person, and it'll ultimately harm us if we don't, okay? So that's a lot of words, but I'm going to jump in now and give you 3 things that differentiate ethical influence from manipulation. First, we always have to be truthful. And it's not enough to tell the truth. We never hide the truth either. If we know that something will materially impact somebody's decision-making, even if we think it's a negative on our side, we have to make sure that we talk about it. But we do learn through influence that we can talk about that in such a way that we gain credibility as being an honest individual, and we might be able to still overcome that weakness in our case. So that's our first thing. The second is we only use these principles of persuasion in ways that are natural to the situation. So for example, if something is not scarce, we don't try to employ scarcity. If lots of people aren't doing something, we don't try to claim social proof. We only use the principles that are naturally available in the situation. And then the third thing that we have to do is whatever we are trying to influence somebody into has to be good for them. It can't just be one-sided good for us. It's got to be good for them. And I put it this way: good for you, good for me, then we're good to go. And if we can hit all 3 of those, I think we can look ourselves in the mirror and feel good about how we're interacting with people.
And so it's really a discovery process of finding out what's important to them and then positioning value. And I had to laugh because I remember hearing this ad for about 25 years. Hurry while supplies last. It doesn't work as far as scarcity because it has no credibility, but
Right.
there's very clear distinction on ethical.
Yeah. And you're right. People are used to these worn out lines, like especially online, when you're buying something that's online, so often it's not scarce. And yet people will try to claim some form of scarcity, and people see right through that, and it just deadens them to that.
Yeah, Amazon has ruined that for anyone who is trying to use that technique, right? Like you could just get everything on Amazon in a couple of days. The worst case, you have to wait 4 days.
Yeah. But then what people need to be creative about is, what is it that maybe I'm offering that, while it might not be the last one, it might be very unique. It could be a signed copy. So yeah, we can all buy books. Maybe we can't get a signed copy. And so that part might be scarce or rare. So figuring out how to position something to bring forth its uniqueness is a form of scarcity. But that old hurry while they last, yeah, most people, I don't think, pay much attention to that anymore.
Can you talk a little bit about applying some of these principles to the intangibles? I think that's, within our community, we have business leaders and HR, change management professionals. And so the influence that we're trying to do is often not to purchase something.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it is, right? To maybe it's purchase a software or some kind of tangible thing that would help the organization, but it's more about influencing a new way of behavior or a new change or an organizational structure shift. And how can we apply some of these principles to that kind of influence?
Okay. Well, when I talk about influence, my primary goal I look at is behavior change, because as an example, I came out of the insurance industry, and most people realize now that texting and driving is a bad thing, that it causes all kinds of harm for drivers. If I gave a presentation on texting and driving and shared facts, I'm sure that many people would go, wow, I didn't realize that. You've changed my thinking. But if they get in their car and they continue to text and drive, have I really accomplished anything? Probably not. So when I look at it, I default to Aristotle's definition. He said that persuasion was the art of getting someone to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do if you didn't ask. So how can we communicate with that person to change their behavior? If we can change how they think or feel about it, that can be very good, because sometimes it'll take on a lasting change. Because if our interaction with somebody changes how they view themselves, their self-identity, most people act in accordance with their self-identity. So it can be very valuable to change how people think and feel about something. But a lot of times we just need them to do something, right? If our kids, we don't care if they think a clean room is a good idea. We want them to get in and clean their room. We want to change their behavior. So when we understand that, then the goal for the organization is what are the behaviors that we need people to adopt in order to bring about the change, which should ultimately be about moving the company forward for success. So when you step back and then you begin to see, okay, here are the behavior changes, then you can start being strategic about, well, which principles might be the best ones to engage to make that change come about. And that could be very specific to what an organization wants. But as an example, it may be that a leader needs to get in there more and be that person that everybody knows and likes, that they'll run through a brick wall for that person. Okay, that leader may need to change his or her behavior and start to become more relational and learn about employees and let them learn about them and really start to form a relationship. So when the time comes and they say, look, we really need this from you, people are going to step up and say, absolutely.
I can really relate to that. A client that I'm working with right now is going through a change, a big one. And I'm there helping with the change management effort, and it's a retail environment. They're changing all of their systems and ways of working. It's long-term benefits, right? And so all the executives and the management team, they realize all these long-term benefits, but I'm working on communication for the floor associate. And this is an hourly worker who might be in college and off, to start their career. So they don't care what's going to happen to the company. Not necessarily what's going to happen to the company 5 years from now. It's not really something that they can anchor to, right? And so by talking about all this case for change and why this is good and long-term benefits, they're like, okay, but this sounds terrible for me for tomorrow, right? Like, you're going to make these changes and it makes my work harder, actually. And so applying that principle of, yeah, you're doing this good for the future of the organization, which might not benefit you in the long term, whether you choose to stay or not, but you really like your store manager. And so you're going to do this because it helps the store manager and it helps the overall team in the store, right? I'm thinking this is helping me in real time, Brian, because as I start working on these communications, great examples.
Yeah, most people, we always hear the thing about people don't leave companies, they leave managers. There may be a lot of truth to that, but when you are deeply connected to the person that you're working for, you will put forth much more effort. And I can say from a personal experience that the company I used to work for, the first CEO, his name was Bob Bailey, and he would go to every of the regional offices quarterly and he would walk the floor. He would sit, he's the CEO of this big company, but he would sit down with, people in their cubicle. Hey, how's it going? And he had an uncanny memory. And so he would talk about their family, but people felt connected to him. And the same with his subsequent, with his, the individual who followed after him, he was very relational. Then we got a CEO who wasn't, and people didn't feel connected to that person at all. The first guys, if they would have said, hey, we're in a difficult situation, we need people to come in for half days, 5 out of the next 8 Saturdays, they would have had a lot of people saying, I'll come in all 8, I'll work all day, because they were so connected to them. When the last CEO was there, I think people would have grumbled under their breath, like, darn it, I had stuff to do. And they would only maybe operate out of fear, like, oh, if I don't come in, I'm going to get in trouble. It was completely different in terms of what people would put into the company because of their connection to the leader.
I think this would be a good point to give an overview of the core principles and then to discuss how differing people respond in differing situations, but just a quick executive summary of the core principles.
Okay, so there are 7 principles of persuasion, and these are just ways that people typically think and act. They're neither good nor bad. How we employ them reveals something about our character. And again, we never want to manipulate somebody into doing something. The first principle that we talk about is liking, and everybody who's listening to this will get it. We prefer to say yes to people that we know and like, right? Everybody knows that, but people don't always know how to thoughtfully and strategically put that into play. The next principle, which is along the lines of liking but goes much deeper, is called unity. And that is about having shared identity. We prefer to say yes to people who are of us, of our tribe, that we share an identity with. A great example of that was my dad served in the Marines. He would do anything for another Marine. And when he helped a Marine, it was like he's helping himself. So that goes even deeper than just a mere connection through liking. And then there's reciprocity, the feeling of obligation we have to give back to people who first give to us. Those 3 principles are very good for building out relationships when you can tap into them. And then there's a couple of principles that are very good for helping people move beyond states of uncertainty. And the first one that we talk about is called authority, which simply says we typically will defer to people with superior wisdom or expertise. If we know somebody's really smart, we're more likely to follow their lead. And then there's what we call consensus or social proof, that we will look to other people. Humans are social creatures, and we will look to other people to see how are they thinking, what are they feeling, what are they doing, because it all impacts how we think, how we feel, and what we do. And then the last 2 principles that we talk about are especially good for motivating people to action. The first one that we talk about there is called consistency. And that describes the reality that we feel this internal psychological pressure, but also an external social pressure to be consistent in what we say and what we do. It really boils down to this: word and deed. Most people feel better about themselves when their words and deeds line up. And the icing on the cake is they look better to the people that they've committed to. And then the final principle, which we have touched on a little bit, is scarcity. We value things more when we believe they're rare or diminishing, going away. And when all of a sudden we think something might not be available, there's a natural instinct in most people to want that thing. So these are the 7 principles that we talk about. And there's just a variety of ways to apply them, whether it's leadership, sales process, dealing with personality styles. But these are core principles that people all around the world, to one degree or another, operate by.
Well, and so then that leads to, you said we already touched on scarcity, but we touched on it from the standpoint of misuse of it when it's not true. So the first question on the ethical is it true? And you've covered that clearly. But now you're leading to something which I really like in the book, is recognizing that all of these principles are true, and they may not matter in this situation to this person. So you might have something that's scarce and it's true, but it's not of value. So you need to establish the value first. And so talk a little bit about the different personality types and which one principles tend to resonate more strongly than others.
Well, when I was doing sales training with my corporate job, we had brought an outside vendor in, and they did some personality assessments, and they used a 4-quad system, very similar to DISC. And there was a guy who worked with me, and he said, man, it would be really interesting if we could tie these principles of influence over to these personality types to see if there's more effective ways to communicate with people. And I thought that's a really good idea. And so what I did was I set up a survey with my blog readers, and I would have them self-identify. I would give them very detailed descriptions of the personality styles. And then I would have them answer a series of questions so we could assess whether or not there was a statistical difference between the 4 groups. And there was. So I worked with a young guy who was studying to be an actuary, and he analyzed the numbers and gave me the thumbs up. The personalities that I renamed them, I call it driver, expressive, amiable, and logical. And I did that very intentionally because it spells deal. And we deal with people, and salespeople hope to close deals. So it makes it very memorable. But the driver is an individual who is very task focused. They will stay at the office to finish the task long before they'll go out to maybe socialize with people. They're about getting stuff done, and they like to be in control. That's the two main things. And there's a lot more that you could get into. Expressives like to be in control also, but they are much more relationship focused. I think a great example of an expressive individual would be like Oprah Winfrey. Everything I know about Oprah Winfrey, she is in complete control of her media empire, but she wants to know about you and she wants to know about your story. So she is very relational. And then we can move over to the amiable. The amiable is also a relational individual, but they're not about controlling others or situations. And then the final is the logical person. They are very task-driven, but they're not about controlling you or others. They're more about focus on self-control and their own thought process and methodically going about doing things. So those are the four principle or the four personality styles that I typically work with salespeople on. And then what we do is we start talking about, well, if I've got 5 minutes with a driver, what principles would probably be most effective with that individual? So when you look at a driver, for example, talking about what they might gain is not going to probably resonate with them because they're probably super successful anyway. But if you just churn that a little bit and talk about what they might lose, that probably catches their attention. So that's an application of scarcity. So I don't go into a driver and say, I got $1 million idea. I might go into the driver and say, we're losing $1 million a year. And they'll say, what? Well, because we're not doing this, we're foregoing $1 million a year, right? It's the same thing, but I'm just reframing it.
Yeah.
So we start looking at the different principles so that we can tailor, it may be the same thing that we're trying to convince them of or persuade them on, but I'm using different psychology and I'm talking about it differently. And we can go in as much detail as you want, but that's a nice high-level overview of the model.
Well, I think that's enough of an overview for now, and we're going to recommend reading the book, but I love the acronym. And the important thing to recognize is these principles are always in operation, but we want to be very specific to the individual and the situation for them to have maximum impact on hearts, minds, and behavior.
Yeah.
I think that's a good framework.
You know, everybody, when I talk about these and I start to get into detail, everybody gets it. And as they should, because it describes human behavior and they're all human beings. And so most of the time they're either thinking like, oh, that's how the salesperson got me to buy the car. Or they might be thinking, I didn't realize what I was doing, but that's why people respond to me the way that they do. And what I want them to do is take it from oh, this is common sense, or I already know this, to thoughtfully starting to look for the opportunities to put that into practice so they can enjoy more success at the office, get more yeses, and even at home. You know, I know that life in my home is a lot more peaceful and happy when my wife and daughter more willingly say yes to the things I ask of them. And so I'm very thoughtful about how I approach them. And they've learned this too. So they're very thoughtful about how they approach me. And it does make life more peaceful and happy.
Well, the key word there for me was practice. You have the intention and you have the framework. Mm-hmm. Next comes the practice. And that's consistent with the things we've been talking about with our guests over the last few weeks, and in terms of being curious and appreciating what is and coming from your own true north, mm-hmm. and then practicing. Some things work sometimes, some don't.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing it up, Tom, because I do emphasize that in the book, that the young character that you, if you read the book that you follow along with, he recognizes that as he starts learning these principles and putting them into practice, that he stumbles and he's not always successful and it doesn't feel natural. But most of us, if we think about a hobby or a sport that we enjoy, as we were first learning, it was uncomfortable. And I use golf as an example because my wife's a really good golfer and I used to golf some. I know that anytime I worked with a golf pro and that individual had me change my stance or my grip or anything, it didn't feel natural. But what I had to trust was that person is an expert. They know what they're doing. And if I follow the advice and I practice, I will get better. And it's the same thing with influence, because some people will say, well, that's just not me. You're right. It's not you, but it can become you if you practice and you learn from mistakes and you keep refining it. And all of a sudden, before you know it, you're actually using this without even thinking about it much.
And I could say, if you were to take your hero, John, then you could find very early in the book, he had a list of all the things he needed to be influential right there. So we could put that list in front of us, which he did, and then get busy with practicing. I love that.
Thank you.
I have new Post-it notes that are going to be going up on my mirror or my laptop screen, or right? So many of them, but it's all about the practice until you get comfortable with that new behavior, right? This is everything that we teach around change management. It's, you're going to stumble, it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to think it's miserable at first, and then you'll start seeing the light, and then eventually you'll forget about the old way of doing things. And there's a similar curve, like most things in life. We have to keep practicing, and we'll fall behind and lose track and have to just get back up and keep doing it when it's important to you. And that's, I think, the key thing is so many things we need to practice, but it's which is the practice that is the most important and beneficial for you. And once you make that decision, then you can carry those things forward.
Right. And I think this is so important for people in your position, Adrian, because you know the mechanics of change and all the things that you laid out there. But then if you step back and say, what is it that I need to do to get people to embrace this so that they're going on that change journey? And that's where these principles can start coming in. And many of the things you probably know too, like, trying to get that vocal advocate, pulling them aside. And because if they can vouch for it, it has more credibility than you. And so very strategically working with people through that process. The mistake that some people will make is just laying out the process. Well, here's the plan. Well, we got to get people to execute the plan. That's where we need the yeses. Yep,
absolutely. Yeah. Too many times I've been asked to do the presenting and like, no, nobody should know me. But I'm not the one who's the influential person. It can't be me. It needs to be the business leader. It needs to be the driver of that change, not the consultant who comes in, lays out the plan and leaves. Right.
Yeah. To that point, when I used to do presentations for insurance agents that would come into the company, and I might get up and I would talk perhaps about the bonus plan or some of the training that we had. Well, of course, I have a stake in it. I work for the company. And so I'm going to be an advocate. But what I would always do is I would look at all the agents that were coming into the meeting. Then I'd find the ones who'd been through the specific training that I would talk about. I'd call them up and I might say, hey, Tom, I know you're coming in 2 weeks. I know that you've also been through the XYZ training. Tell me about it. What was the experience like? And almost every time agents like Tom were raving about it. And I'd say, Tom, I'm going to be talking about it, but I know that people like you would say, well, I got a vested interest in this. Would you be willing to share a little bit about your experience? I never had an insurance agent who wouldn't stand up in front of their peers and talk. So I would get 2 or 3 advocates. And once I got talking, I would just pause and say, look, I know you guys think that I've got a vested interest. Let's hear from some people in the audience who've been through the training. And that was the gold that they needed. Once they heard their peers say that they liked it, they were on board.
It's a great example. A lot of people are looking for a formula, and you could have the formula. The golden rule is a formula, but without commitment and without practice, then it's just 7 steps of success. It's interesting that it's 7 habits. So we need the points. We need the practice.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Brian. This has been such a wonderful introduction. It's, coming in and thinking about I'm someone who would be the first to say, I hate selling. I don't like selling, but I love talking to people and understanding what is their situation and is there something that I can provide to them to help them to resolve or make that situation better. And to that reframing of that's the influence factor, and it's not in the unethical, traditional thinking of salespeople.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who rail against the word selling, and like you, Adrian, they like, I don't want anything to do with it because you've had bad experiences. But the reality is, we are trying to influence people every day, and far more than most people realize. We are trying to, whether it's as simple as return a call or an email or join me for lunch, we're trying to change behaviors. And it's just really important then that we understand what it is that we can do in an ethical manner to make that happen. Selling, when I love Brian Tracy's definition, selling is the process of persuading a person that whatever you're offering is worth more to him or her than the price you're asking. So selling, it's a process. So in like most things, change is a process, right? You've learned that there are certain things you do, and if you follow that pattern, you'll have more chance of success. It's a process. It's about persuasion, using these psychological concepts. And it's about saying, look, what I'm asking of you here, it's going to be in your benefit. If you do buy this product, this service, implement this change, you will be happy that you did, because it's going to pay dividends long past the implementation date. And if we can just, step back and think about it that way instead of selling, more people would be engaged in wanting to do that.
Yeah, engaged in the conversation. And if it's a right fit, it's a right fit.
And getting people to the place that they can responsibly say yes or no, and that we haven't violated anybody in such a way that if they say no, it damages the relationship.
I think, and to do that, Tom, we just give people permission. I often tell people, look, I appreciate you taking my call today. And let me tell you up front, if we talk about something and you say this isn't right for me, or you say no, or not now, or maybe late, you won't offend me. I just want you to be honest, because the last thing I want to do is waste your time and waste my time. But if we think there's a chance, then I'd love to have the conversation go on and find that opportunity. And usually people exhale when you say something like that. It's like, finally, I can be really upfront with this person. And again, it's to both of our benefit, because I don't want to keep knocking on a door if somebody doesn't want me knocking on the door. But if they do, then it's like, hey, just tell me what's the right cadence to follow up. And whenever the time is right, things will come together.
Well, we have unity, to use that term, on that philosophy. And thank you so much for investing the time to talk with us about influence. Is there any, we'll also post it on our site, but is there any information that you would like to leave them with, how to get in touch with you? And we'll put all this in print as well.
Okay. Best way would be LinkedIn. I connect with everybody, and I will guarantee you this: if you're listening to this and you reach out and you don't put a personal message like, hey, I heard you on the podcast, I will come back and ask you how you found me, because I like to know why people are reaching out, where the traffic is coming from, but it also puts the social back in social media. So I will have a personal response back. And even if you do give me the reason, I'm going to reach back and say thank you and hope you enjoyed it. But there will be personal interaction for everybody who reaches out to me.
Good. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brian.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Beyond podcast. We hope you benefited from this conversation as much as we have. We invite you to join our community of conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to sign up at aleadershipbeyond.com for free materials and updates. That's aleadershipbeyond.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode.